Hi, in this video we're going to look at the first of the principal grounds that I mentioned before. Actually, we're going to look at the fourth of the principal grounds, but the first in terms of understanding, and that's the ground place. Now, place is incredibly simple, and it's the basis of all our movement. Silver takes time to define it for us very specifically, in the same way as he does with most of his terminology. And what he says is, know that the place is where one may strike or thrust home without putting in of his foot. Okay? Very simple. You may strike or thrust at a target home without a step. And that little bit, without putting in of his foot, is possibly the most important bit that Silver has written in his whole system. And what that does is it allows everything else to fall into place and shows that this is in fact an integrated system, and it is significantly different to the other contemporary systems that were around at the time. And Silver tells us that it's different, but most people don't believe him. They look at Silver and they say, this is a bit complicated, I don't quite understand what it is he's saying. So they look at other contemporary systems, they see similar terminology because everybody was using the same terminology, and they assume that Silver means what they meant. And Silver is quite clear that what he's talking about is not what they're talking about. And that's exactly what's going on with place. This is the basic point. If we get this right, then everything else falls into place. Now, excuse me, I'm going to grab a sword. This is one of the night shop basket-hilted single-handed swords, exactly as we discussed in the training weapons recommendation. This one is actually a long sword blade that I've cut down. Still waiting for my freebie sword, Brian, so I can do a tutorial on how to cut them down. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at this punch bag as our target. Now, clearly, from here, I can thrust home or strike home without putting in of my foot. Right? Beautiful. Really simple. Now, if I'm further away, now I don't even know if I'm in shot here, I'm going to assume I am, right? I'm just out of range, which means I'm not in the place there, and I am in the place here. Now, this is interesting because the place is not a static concept, and if you think about it, this becomes really obvious. This is a sword that's suited for my stature, okay? Now, if I were to be using a slightly shorter sword, what you'll find is that I'm not in the place in a different area. Now, here, of course, I'm still in the place. I can strike or thrust home without putting in of my foot. But I don't have to move away as far to no longer be able to do that, to not be in the place. And that's very important. Now, the other thing that changes is the target area that I'm looking at. Now, if I'm looking at cutting here, what we get is effectively my longest reach. I'm bending my knee, which allows my weight to go forward slightly. I'm stretching my arm and sword out horizontally so that it reaches the furthest. I'm in the place for this particular cut or this particular thrust. Now, if I were to try and cut higher up, I may not be in the place. And that's a very important concept. If our opponent is standing in a tip forward guard, something that Silver refers to as forehand, the hands in front, now what you'll find is that firstly their sword is closer to you, their hand is closer to you than their body, and so on. So you could be in the place to strike or thrust home at their hand, but not in the place to strike or thrust home at their foot, or their head, or their torso. And what that means is that every single action you take with the sword has its own specific definition of place. And that's really, really important, and you'll see why it's important when we come on to look at time.